Ladies and gentlemen, in chess, scandals are rare. But in 2022, the board shook. Two names, Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann, clashed in a controversial battle, the only one where cheating was accused. Accusations, withdrawals, online chaos. Was it cheating? Was it mind games? Or was it something deeper? Today, we dive into the match that lit the fuse and the fallout that changed competitive chess forever. Welcome to Hans Niemann versus Magnus Carlsen. Quote ChatGPT 2025. Now that you know what the video is about and the 1 minute intro, let's begin. So, we have, of course, the game that, created a huge scandal in chess in 2022. Many people were accusing Hans Niemann of cheating since he won against, well, former world champion, but he was world champion at the time, Magnus Carlsen. So they thought he was all bluff. He didn't win. But, and as we can see, actually, Magnus Carlsen is rated about 200 points above Hans Niemann. And it was actually revealed that he had online cheating. He actually cheated online. He admitted to it. So people were suspicious after this, but FIDE couldn't ban Hans Niemann, and he's still playing competitively. So, this was on chess.com, the famous Singfield Cup in 2022. Now, I think this match was over the board, but it was held mainly on chess.com. Knight of 6, c4. We have starting position of King's Indian, but then we switch to a Nimzo Indian. Bishop to b4, g3. Magnus plays this interesting setup. A more common setup would be knight to f3 immediately, or actually e3 is a common move. Instead, Magnus plays a more rare system with g3, bishop to g2 immediately rather than knight f3. And Hans is going to take advantage that Magnus hasn't castled yet. So d5. Now Magnus decides it's a great time to kick out the bishop, takes. And if you capture here, this is considered what Hans played. An interesting position, I would say. If I would call this the open Nimso. It's kind of like an open Catalan, except it's relatively different in terms. So white has the bishop pair. He's down a pawn, but this bishop is now amazing on this diagonal and will cause huge problems for black in the future. So we have knight to f3, c5. So now Hans is up a pawn. He is going to try to sacrifice it and even out. Because remember, this is Magnus. If Hans draws Magnus, it's also going to cause a huge controversy in the chess world. So his ultimate goal is to draw this game. Instead, Magnus doesn't accept. If you accept here, it's likely a draw. Firstly, things get a bit more complicated as Hans may attempt to make Magnus not castle. And so Magnus doesn't want to risk all this stuff and potentially draw or lose. Losing is possible in this position. So we have here castles and c4, queen d4. And now Magnus declares that he is going to win in the endgame. Because if you capture here, actually, let's say play rook to d8. Magnus actually, after a few moves, let's say bishop g4, knight to c6, rook to, not wrong rook to c1, knight takes, rook takes. It looks like Magnus is down a pawn, but actually if you trade here, if you capture here, the problem is there is this, and now your knight is actually trapped. So be careful. If you, let's say, capture here, now look at Magnus's bishop. He's down a pawn, but This active development is doing a number on black. Magnus is just going to play rook to b1 and straight up actually win this pawn on b7. And Hans can't do anything about it. So Hans would rather not trade queens, and instead he plays knight to c6. And now, I don't know what's happening here. Now, if Magnus captures, Hans gets it his way, since Hans got an extra move, which is knight to c6. And now his pawn structure isn't as good. He has two isolated pawns, though Hans' c pawn is also a target. We have e5. Yeah, instead Magnus doesn't take, so we have e5. Hans wants to take advantage of this queen on c4 with bishop to e6, bishop to g5. Magnus pins Hans's queen. h6, rook f to d1. We have a Zwischenzug. You obviously don't want to take here, so as we have it, Magnus would optimally back up or capture. In this case, he could capture, but you would rather, before playing bishop to e3 automatically, or never play bishop takes f6. That shouldn't even be a move that appears in your mind. Let's say if you play bishop to e3, this bishop isn't optimally placed, which we call it. It looks active, but it'll cause problems in the future because it's blocking the f pawn. So optimally, white would rather take on f6, which is usually fine if the g pawn must recapture, like the queen can't recapture. In this case, the queen can. So Magnus plays the smart intermediate move, rook f to d1, rook a to d1. Now this is an important point. Usually people don't know which rook to put on this square. You have to think about which rook is doing the best right now, like where it's absolutely needed. The f pawn right now is pretty secure, and the f file likely won't open. So rook f to d1 is a better option, while the a file and b file might be needed for this rook to attack the pawns on the queen side. So using that logic, you should play rook f to d1. Now it's the same situation for Hans. If he just moves the queen, he's still under this pin and under some pressure. He lets Magnus get this file completely. So rather than that, he plays an intermediate move, counterattacking the queen, and it's an equal trade. And this is where people believe that Hans started to cheat, because firstly, winning a game, an end game, by the way, against Magnus is a big controversy. Like, it's impossible practically. So they didn't believe it. But it is interesting to analyze how Hans actually did this. Here there are a few possible moves. You don't have to take, but taking is of course the best move. And now, as we can see, Magnus has completely forced Hans into a worse position for sure. He's now equal on pawns. 4 pawns and then 2 pawns here. Look, his bishop has amazing prospects than these 2 pieces over here, which are doing not much. And his rook is not even active. Like, Magnus can just straight out take the e file. So we have king to f1 instead. Because the problem is that if you play rook to d1, you blunder bishop to e2. And if you take time to protect it, which is like this, which happens in the game, you give Hans the file, which he takes. So you have to weigh out these choices, and Magnus decides that he would rather protect the pawn. Though actually rook to d1 is an interesting move, because bishop takes e2, rook to d7, and now black will either have to play b6, which runs into various captures, like you can play here. We can't really play here because there's takes. And now there is rook to c8 and black wins on the pawns. You have to be careful. It looks that white is fine. You're like, oh, cool tactic. Let's go. But then actually, black is winning because he wins the c pawn and he'll just promote his pass pawn. So instead, you can play a positional move like knight to h4, and black's king is getting swarmed while there is now a skewer. If you back up, there is now rook to c7, and black cannot defend it, the knight. So black will have to play rook to c8 instead. My computer needs help. Where you can play now knight to f4, you attack the h6 pawn, let's say king to h7, then there's rook to f7. So the only way to really protect it is to play h5, but that runs into actually a nice sequence, if I can take, and there's a fork. So the best move would be, let's see, to play this interesting move, sacrifice the pawn. If white captures, then actually black has chances. So white needs to play rook to e2. And white's going to win this pawn, so white is, of course, better. But still, black has, like, if you're playing white, you need to be a bit careful and know how to convert your endgames. Instead, we have king to f1. We go with the other option. Rook to d8. He takes the file. And king to e1. So now Magnus's plan is to... The problem is that if he converts into a bishop versus knight endgame, you probably couldn't win it, so I wouldn't recommend it. I would recommend playing rook to b1. But somebody like Magnus, against Hans, I wouldn't suggest it's optimal because he lowers his chances to win rather than draw. But he has a point, as these pawns are very disorganized. Yet, none of Hans's pawns can really be targeted by any of Magnus's pieces. So he makes a questionable decision. Let me go back. To play, I don't know what knight to a5 does, maybe knight to b3. Hans doesn't really have any prospects here. He's done all he can. He can play a waiting move like king to g7 perhaps. But then that runs into knight to h4 and this stuff. So maybe to play king to h7. But eventually, Magnus would play this plan, and we would come to a similar position as in the game. We have knight to a5, and Hans declines the trade. This is really odd to me. If I was playing Magnus and I'm Hans, okay, I get that you want to win, but really against a player who's 200 points above you, I'm not sure about that. So he declines the trade, which is a bit odd. I'm not saying he's cheating or anything, but it's a bit suspicious. You have bishop to e6. Hans now gains target on the pawn. c4. Magnus sacrifices the pawn so that he can take the file. And now, like earlier, he gains a lot of activity. So basically what happened in these few moves is that there's really no way to defend this pawn. You can play rook to c1, but then you get into knight to b3, which was, I guess, pre-planned by Hans. So instead we have, of course, knight to d2. And this is a sophisticated plan to play c4. And Magnus's point is that after Hans captures and trades off, I don't know why Hans didn't take like this, but I guess maybe he was scared of rook to d7. That makes sense. So now Magnus has like pretty nice counterplay. He is going to win some pawns on the queen side. But it's so interesting to me how Hans manages to win this game. We have a6, rook to b8. So Magnus is now, as always, locking his pieces onto a target. So, of course, the engine would love it if, like, Hans sacrificed a pawn for activity. I'm not sure why Hans didn't play knight to c6, perhaps because he didn't want to play this endgame against Magnus. But still, it is an interesting endgame because, I mean, Magnus could win this, but I'm not sure your opponent really could. So, if you're black, I would just recommend knight c6 and drawing. Instead, we have f5. Hans is pushing forward. Rook to e8. e4. Hans is going strong. Now g4. This is a really important move. It's not seen as commonly as more a4 or h4s. You'll know what I'm talking about, this higher level people, where you break up the pawn structure. For example, I can't really show you an example in this game, but if we imagine, let me just make a few more moves down here. This is just theoretical, of course. So, okay, I think I got it. So you'd have to insert and now move. Wait, no. Wrong move, sorry. So let's say f5. No, let's say f6, g4, no move, g5, takes, no move, h6. And now, an interesting move in these kind of pawn structures is h4, where you attack at this structure, where usually, in this case, it's no exception, a rook is lying on the other side of the board. This is a more common type of pawn break known. But also, one really important one to remember is this g4 idea, where there is this usually doubled pawn structure, and there is a pawn that is pushed forward or defended by one of the pawns, which, like, so a few criteria would be it has to be doubled pawns, it can't be doubled isolated, and um, there has to be a pawn on one of the adjacent files that is ahead of both of them but protected by one of them. So in this case, we meet all the criteria and g4. So the idea is that Hans's pawn structure is horrible. Magnus is fine sacrificing the pawn because Hans really has no good way to defend the pawn. You can even play h3 and rook to h4 and stuff. Though this is probably losing. Yeah, I'm just throwing out ideas, really. So if Hans takes, let's say now he defends the pawn with f4, but now every pawn move Hans makes comes with a consequence. Rook to f4, king to g6, I'm fine with that. Bishop to e6, rook to c5, I'm fine with that. e4, and now we are completely barging through black's position. Rook to e5, don't care, bishop takes. And there is no way black can really defend his position. He's just going to lose everything. So, we have knight to... Oh, yeah. So, we went a bit far, but what happened was rook to c5, bishop to a2. Now look at this. Magnus has an amazing bishop. He's just going to play rook to e7. E7, and destroy black's position, Hans's position. Now, you may also wonder, how in the world did Hans win this game? And we're going to discuss that. Knight to c4. Hans immediately blocks off Magnus's bishop control. a4, knight to d6. Now Hans takes the liberty of defending all his pawns. Rook to e7 does absolutely nothing. Fg4. He calls the bluff on Magnus. He can no longer take. And now Magnus is down 2 pawns. But it doesn't matter. Magnus has too much activity. But now Hans is rolling in. E3. He sacrifices the knight because if you capture, you lose the game. Because after takes, there is a deflection and black makes the queen and you can't stop it. So that's a really cool sequence Hans finds. So instead we have f e3. Magnus also accepts the bluff, but now look at his pawn structure. And now we see how Hans is completely turning the tables and dominating the game. Knight to e4, king to f1, now rook to c1. Magnus's king is getting completely hunted. Rook to c2, and now we have a fork. Magnus really has no way to survive this. It looks like Magnus is crashing through, but Hans's attack is faster because for some reason, which is kind of suspicious to me, Hans repeats once. I'm not sure. I didn't watch the full live game. I'm not sure if this was because he was in time trouble, but this is really odd to me. We have king to f6, and Hans is just gonna walk. See, this is a really interesting thing. So Hans is just gonna walk his king. Okay, yeah. So I'm just gonna skip through a few moves. Just watch the king. Well, you didn't get to see it really, but what he was gonna do, imagine if, well, he could probably even play here. If Magnus tried to keep on checking him, he could even, actually, what's interesting is that he could even, no, but the problem is he's just gonna walk his king over to h4 where there's no checks. So Magnus decides, okay, I'm really cooked, so I better do something. Which he does by trying to let Hans do something. Hans is coming in with knight to f6 or knight to h6. We have a desperate check, which Hans can actually let Magnus get because there's a fork at the end, and this endgame is completely winning. If you don't know it, I would recommend studying your endgames, but the point of this is that Hans is just gonna either win this pawn immediately, which is viable for this situation, but the usual goal in these endgames is to trade off this knight for this bishop. Because in a king and pawn endgame, this kind of thing where black is up a pawn means that black can actually distract white with his own pawns on the queen side, which isn't possible now, but it will be later. And then he will win all the pawns on the king side. So let me show you an example situation. This is again just stupid moves. Let's say here, here, b5 takes. This is a more extreme situation, but this could not really happen probably, but this is a more extreme situation I'm showing you right now. So the goal is, okay, yeah, now this situation. So white to play, and actually what happens, well, here it's much simpler. You can probably just win all the pawns or push the pawn, but you can use this pawn as a decoy. You can go like this, and white will have to attempt to stop the pawn. And when he does, you can even queen here just for safety's sake. And now you win all these pawns and you queen your own pawns. And white has nothing to do about it. So you should really study up on your endgames. But Magnus is a perfect example of an endgame master. But now the endgame master is getting endgame mastered. We have knight to, and now watch this. So Magnus gets a bit of hope, but then knight to f1. Now Magnus is completely stuck. He loses his pawn, and he eventually just gives up his hope He loses the game. He tries to win this pawn, which Hans let him get, but he loses this pawn, and eventually he falls to the wrath of Hans and resigns. Now, this is the Hans Niemann Magnus Carlsen game. I maybe post your take on this in the comments. Thank you for your viewership. Like and subscribe, and see you later.